The final days of the Second World War remain one of the most intensely debated chapters of human history, not only for the scale of destruction and suffering but also for the decisions that brought about its end. Among the most consequential actions taken was the American decision to drop 2 atomic bombs on Japan in August 1945. To understand why this course of action was chosen, one must carefully trace the political, military, and psychological landscape of the time. The United States, Japan, and indeed the entire world were embroiled in a struggle that had consumed 6 years and left tens of millions dead. By the summer of 1945, Germany had already surrendered, yet Japan continued to fight on. The Pacific War had been marked by extraordinary brutality on both sides, with massive casualties, relentless bombardments, and acts of shocking violence that pushed nations to the edge of endurance. Against this backdrop, the American leadership considered how best to bring Japan to unconditional surrender. The roots of the atomic decision stretched back years. Even before the United States formally entered the war, scientists had been warning President Franklin D. Roosevelt that Nazi Germany might be developing an atomic weapon. This fear led to the Manhattan Project, a secret and massive effort involving some of the world's leading physicists and engineers, which ultimately produced the first nuclear weapons. By the time the bombs were ready for use, Germany had already been defeated and Japan was the remaining adversary. The possession of this new and terrifying weapon raised not only strategic but also moral questions. For American leaders, the overriding concern was how to end the war quickly, decisively, and in a manner that justified the immense expense and secrecy of the Manhattan Project. The weight of this decision fell upon President Harry S. Truman, who had assumed office in April 1945 after Roosevelt's death. Japan in mid-1945 faced devastation on an unprecedented scale. Its cities had been repeatedly bombed by American B-29s, with the March firebombing of Tokyo killing more than 80,000 people in a single night. Industrial production was collapsing, the Navy and Air Force were virtually destroyed, and the civilian population was enduring extreme shortages of food, fuel, and medicine. Yet the Japanese government showed little willingness to surrender. Militarists still held sway, and they believed that holding out might allow Japan to negotiate terms more favorable than unconditional surrender. They hoped to preserve not only the imperial system but also some measure of military pride. Meanwhile, the United States had learned through intercepted communications that Japan was exploring a possible Soviet mediation, though without any clear intention of accepting the Allied demand for complete surrender. The Potsdam Declaration, issued in July 1945 by the United States, Britain, and China, called upon Japan to surrender unconditionally or. The path from the first explosion over Hiroshima to Japan's ultimate surrender was short in days but vast in implications. The bombings were not only acts of military destruction but also psychological blows aimed at shaking the very foundations of Japanese resistance. Yet, to understand why the second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki and why surrender came when it did, one must look closely at the interplay between Japan's internal divisions, the timing of Soviet intervention, and the calculations of the American leadership. The atomic bomb was not used in isolation but rather as part of a wider framework of pressure designed to force Japan to capitulate. In Tokyo, the aftermath of Hiroshima caused confusion rather than immediate surrender. The devastation was undeniable, yet Japanese leaders were divided over its significance. Some military officials believed the United States could not possibly have more than 1 or 2 such weapons, and that Japan could still endure. Others urged continuing the war, hoping to inflict heavy losses on the Americans during an invasion and thereby secure more favorable terms. The Japanese government had long been dominated by a faction unwilling to accept unconditional surrender, particularly if it meant abolishing the imperial institution. At the same time, moderates realized the situation was hopeless but lacked the power to override the hardliners. The psychological shock of Hiroshima alone was not enough to unify the leadership. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union fulfilled its Yalta promise by declaring war on Japan on August 8, just hours before the Nagasaki bombing. The Red Army launched a massive offensive into Japanese-occupied Manchuria, overwhelming the Guangdong Army, which had once been the pride of Japan's military. For Tokyo, this was a catastrophic development. Japan had been hoping that Moscow might mediate peace with the Allies, but now that hope collapsed. The Soviet entry into the war signaled that Japan would be attacked from both east and west, and that any chance of negotiating favorable terms was gone. The simultaneous combination of atomic destruction and Soviet invasion created a crisis that Japan could not withstand. In Washington, Truman and his advisors watched these events unfold with a mixture of determination and calculation. The decision to drop the second bomb, so soon after Hiroshima, has been the subject of intense debate. Some argue it was unnecessary, as Japan was already reeling. Others point out that the Japanese had not surrendered after Hiroshima and that only overwhelming, repeated shock could compel them to act. There was also the issue of demonstrating that the United States possessed more than one bomb. If Japan or the Soviet Union believed the atomic strike was a one-time weapon, its psychological impact would be diminished. By striking twice in rapid succession, the United States conveyed both the scale of its destructive capability and its willingness to use it again. The surrender of Japan after the twin shocks of Hiroshima and Nagasaki did not close the book on the atomic bombings but instead opened an era of intense reflection, debate, and consequence. In the immediate aftermath, the United States celebrated victory and relief washed over a world exhausted by 6 years of relentless conflict. Yet even in those early days, questions arose that have echoed through history: were the bombs necessary, were they justified, and what did their use mean for the future of humanity? The reasons behind the American decision to use nuclear weapons on Japan must therefore be examined not only in the wartime context but also in the enduring legacy they created. In the months following Japan's surrender, the devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki became clearer to the outside world. Photographs, eyewitness accounts, and reports from journalists revealed scenes that seemed almost beyond comprehension. Cities flattened into rubble, charred corpses lying in streets, survivors wandering like shadows, their skin burned and hanging from their bodies. Radiation sickness, then a mysterious phenomenon, killed many who had initially survived the blasts. Hospitals were overwhelmed, doctors and nurses themselves were among the dead, and entire neighborhoods ceased to exist. The scale of human suffering challenged the narrative that the bombings were simply a military act designed to shorten the war. For many observers, the attacks introduced an entirely new kind of horror that transcended traditional warfare. Within the United States, however, the dominant perception remained that the bombs had saved lives. The figure often cited, that an invasion would have cost hundreds of thousands of American dead and millions of Japanese, was repeated in newspapers, speeches, and official reports. This justification became the foundation of the American defense of the bombings. To a population still mourning the losses of Pearl Harbor, Bataan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, the atomic strike seemed a grim but necessary conclusion. For Truman himself, the reasoning was clear: he had been handed a weapon that could end the war quickly, and not using it would have meant more bloodshed. In his later writings and public statements, he insisted that the bombings prevented far greater loss of life and that he never doubted his decision. Yet historians, scholars, and even contemporaries of the time have questioned whether this was the whole truth. Japan's situation in the summer of 1945 was indeed desperate. Its navy had been destroyed, its air force crippled, its economy strangled by blockade, and its cities systematically firebombed. Some argue that surrender was inevitable, with or without atomic bombs. The role of the Soviet Union's entry into the war is central to this debate. Many scholars contend that it was the Soviet invasion of Manchuria that delivered the decisive blow to Japanese hopes. With Moscow now an enemy and no possibility of mediation, Japan